Lynchburg, Virginia, 1932. Desmond Doss was just 13 years old when he almost became a killer. He and his older brother Harold were doing what brothers do, roughhousing in the backyard, throwing punches, testing limits. But this time, things went too far. Desmond grabbed a brick. In a moment of pure rage, he brought it down on Harold's head. His brother collapsed, blood pouring from the wound. Desmond stood there, frozen, watching his brother's blood pool on the ground, realizing he'd almost ended his own sibling's life. Harold survived, but something inside Desmond shattered that day. The Doss family wasn't wealthy. His father, Thomas, was a carpenter who struggled with his own demons after serving in World War I. The war had broken something inside Thomas, turning him into a violent, unpredictable man who drank heavily and terrorized his family. Desmond watched his mother, Bertha, endure years of abuse, saw his father pull a gun during arguments, witnessed the destruction that violence brings to a home. The Doss household was a war zone long before Desmond ever stepped foot on a battlefield. But Bertha was deeply religious, a devout Seventh-day Adventist who raised her children with strict biblical principles. On the wall of their modest home hung a framed poster of the Ten Commandments, each one illustrated with a small picture. Young Desmond would stare at that poster for hours, particularly at the sixth commandment, "Thou shalt not kill." The illustration showed Cain standing over Abel's lifeless body, the first murder in human history. After what happened with Harold, that image burned itself into Desmond's mind. He made a vow that day, a promise to God and to himself. He would never take another human life, no matter the circumstances, no matter the cost. His faith became everything. The Seventh-day Adventist Church taught pacifism, taught that Saturday was the true Sabbath, taught that the body was a temple and that killing violated God's direct commandment. For Desmond, these weren't just religious guidelines. They were absolutes, lines he would never cross, even if it meant facing ridicule, even if it meant risking his own life. His childhood had shown him two paths, his father's path of violence and destruction, or his mother's path of faith and forgiveness. Desmond chose his mother's path, and he would follow it straight into hell itself. But here's what nobody talks about. Desmond wasn't naive. He wasn't some sheltered kid who didn't understand the real world. He'd grown up watching his father's PTSD destroy their family. He knew what war did to men. He knew that violence created more violence, that killing left scars that never healed. And yet, when his country called, he didn't run. He didn't hide behind his religious beliefs to avoid service. He did something far more terrifying. He volunteered to walk into combat without any way to defend himself. December 7, 1941. Pearl Harbor was burning, and America was thrust into a war that would reshape the entire world. Young men across the country were lining up at recruitment offices, eager to fight, eager to prove themselves. Desmond Doss was 22 years old, working at a shipyard in Newport News, Virginia, and he had a decision to make. His job gave him a deferment. He could have stayed home, stayed safe, avoided the whole nightmare. But that wasn't who Desmond was. He believed in serving his country, believed that freedom was worth fighting for. He just believed there was a different way to fight. So he did something that seemed impossible, something that would make him a target from day one. He enlisted in the United States Army as a conscientious objector, refusing to carry or use any weapon. Not because he was a coward, not because he was trying to get out of combat, but because his faith demanded it, and he wasn't willing to compromise his soul, not even for his country. The Army didn't know what to do with him. Conscientious objectors typically served in non-combat roles, far from the front lines. But Desmond insisted on being a medic, insisted on being right there in the thick of battle, saving lives instead of taking them. Around this same time, Desmond met the woman who would change everything. Her name was Dorothy Shutt, and he saw her for the first time at the Park Avenue Seventh-day Adventist Church. She was beautiful, kind, and shared his deep faith. They connected immediately, drawn together by their beliefs and their values. Dorothy saw something in Desmond that others missed. Where some saw stubbornness, she saw conviction. Where others saw foolishness, she saw courage. They fell in love quickly, the way people do when they know time might be short money, when war is looming and every moment feels precious. Before Desmond shipped out for basic training, Dorothy gave him a small Bible. Inside the cover, she wrote an inscription that would sustain him through the darkest moments of his life. "If we don't meet again in this world, I'll meet you in heaven." Think about that for a second. She was 23 years old, in love, giving her fiancé a Bible with a message that acknowledged he might not come home. She knew what he was walking into. She knew that his refusal to carry a weapon made him even more vulnerable. And she loved him anyway, supported his decision anyway, married him anyway. They wed on August 17, 1942, at the same church where they'd met. It was a simple ceremony filled with family and friends from their Adventist community. Desmond wore his Army uniform. Dorothy wore a modest white dress. They had just a few weeks together before he had to report for duty, just a few weeks to be husband and wife before the war would tear them apart. Dorothy held on to that Bible she'd given him, knowing that soon he'd be carrying it into combat zones where most men carried rifles. She believed in him, believed in his mission, believed that somehow God would protect him. But believing doesn't make the fear go away. It doesn't make the waiting any easier. As Desmond prepared to leave for Fort Jackson, South Carolina, he had no idea what was waiting for him. He thought his faith would be respected, thought his commitment to serve would be honored. He thought wrong. The moment he stepped into that barracks, his real war began. And it had nothing to do with the Japanese. Fort Jackson, South Carolina. The moment Desmond walked into the barracks of Company B, 77th Infantry Division, he became a target. His fellow soldiers didn't see a brave man willing to serve without weapons. They saw a liability, a coward, someone who would get them all sent home in body bags. The ridicule started immediately. They called him a yellow belly, a fake Christian hiding behind the Bible, a burden that didn't belong in the Army. But the verbal abuse was just the beginning. Desmond refused to work on Saturdays, his Sabbath, unless lives were at stake. While other soldiers had their downtime, Desmond spent his Saturdays in worship and prayer. This didn't sit well with his superiors or his fellow troops. They saw it as special treatment, as him thinking he was better than everyone else. The resentment grew into something darker, something dangerous. Late at night, when the barracks were quiet, soldiers would corner him. They'd rough him up, throw punches, try to break him down. Desmond never fought back. He took the beatings in silence, never reported a single incident, never gave them the satisfaction of seeing him crack. His company commander, Captain Jack Glover, was convinced Desmond was mentally unstable. How else could you explain a man who volunteered for combat but refused to defend himself? Glover tried everything to get Doss discharged. He had him evaluated for Section 8, a military discharge for mental illness or instability. The Army psychiatrists examined Desmond, asked him questions, tried to find something wrong with him. But Desmond wasn't crazy. He was clear-minded, articulate, absolutely certain about his convictions. The doctors couldn't justify the discharge. He was sane, just deeply religious, and there was no regulation that said you had to carry a weapon to serve in the infantry. When the psychiatric angle failed, Glover tried a different approach. He threatened Desmond with court-martial for refusing to obey direct orders to carry a rifle. This was serious. A court-martial could mean military prison, a dishonorable discharge, the end of everything Desmond believed he was supposed to do. The case was moving forward, and Desmond's military career was hanging by a thread. That's when his father intervened. Thomas Doss, the violent, alcoholic veteran who had terrorized his family for years, suddenly became his son's greatest advocate. Thomas contacted church officials, contacted military brass, used every connection he had from his own service in World War I. He wrote letters, made phone calls, argued that his son had the right to serve according to his religious beliefs. There was precedent for conscientious objectors in non-combat roles. Why couldn't his son serve as a medic? Why was the Army trying to force him into a role that violated his faith? Thomas's intervention worked. The court-martial was dropped, and Desmond was allowed to continue his training as a combat medic without carrying a weapon. But the damage was done. His reputation in the unit was destroyed before he ever saw combat. Here's the thing that people miss about this period. Desmond could have quit at any point. He could have accepted a transfer to a medical unit far from the front lines. He could have let them discharge him and gone home to Dorothy, but he didn't. When Captain Glover and the other soldiers questioned his courage, Desmond looked them in the eye and said something that would echo through history. "Don't ever doubt my courage, because I am willing to die for my country. I just won't kill for it." That statement shut them up, at least temporarily. But words are cheap. Desmond would have to prove himself where it mattered most, and that opportunity was coming faster than anyone expected. July 21st, 1944, the 77th Infantry Division hit the beaches of Guam, and Desmond Doss got his first taste of real combat. The island was heavily fortified by Japanese forces, and the fighting was brutal from the moment they landed. Bullets were flying, mortars exploding, men screaming for medics. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for. The moment when Desmond would either prove himself or get someone taken out. The soldiers who had beaten him up in training, who had called him a coward, were watching to see if he'd run when the shooting started. Desmond didn't run. He ran toward the gunfire. When soldiers were hit, crying out in agony, Desmond was there, crawling through the mud and blood to reach them. He didn't have a weapon to cover himself. He couldn't fire back at the enemy positions. All he had was his medical kit, his faith, and a determination that bordered on insane. He treated wounds under heavy fire, dragged men to safety while machine guns tore up the ground around him, worked through the chaos with a calmness that defied logic. The Japanese were targeting medics specifically, knowing that taking out the medical personnel would demoralize the entire unit. Desmond didn't care. He had a job to do, and he was going to do it no matter what. By the end of the Guam campaign, something had shifted in Company B. The men who had tormented Desmond during training were now watching him with a different kind of respect. He'd saved lives, their lives, without hesitation and without regard for his own safety. The Army recognized his actions too, awarding him the Bronze Star for exceptional bravery under fire. But Desmond barely acknowledged the medal. For him, this wasn't about recognition or proving people wrong. This was about living out his faith in the most extreme circumstances imaginable. He'd made a promise to God to save lives, and he was keeping that promise. The division moved on to the Philippines in November 1944, landing on Leyte Island. The fighting there was even worse than Guam. The Japanese were dug into the mountains, using caves and fortified positions to rain down fire on the American forces. The jungle was thick, the terrain treacherous, and disease was rampant. Soldiers were falling not just from enemy fire, but from malaria and infected wounds. Desmond worked around the clock, treating the wounded, comforting the dying, pushing his body to limits that should have broken him. During the Philippines campaign, Desmond earned his second Bronze Star. He'd repeatedly exposed himself to enemy fire to rescue wounded soldiers, sometimes spending hours in no man's land retrieving men that everyone else had written off as lost. His fellow soldiers stopped questioning his courage. They stopped seeing him as a liability. Instead, they started seeing him as their best chance of survival if they got hit. Captain Glover, the same officer who had tried to have him court-martialed, later admitted that Desmond Doss was one of the bravest men he'd ever served with. High praise from a man who had done everything possible to get rid of him. But all of this, the medals, the respect, the validation, was just preparation for what was coming. The 77th Infantry Division was about to be thrown into the bloodiest battle of the Pacific War, and Desmond Doss was about to do something so extraordinary that people still struggle to believe it actually happened. April 1945, the island of Okinawa. The Japanese had turned this place into a fortress, and the Americans needed to take it to launch an invasion of mainland Japan. The 77th Infantry Division was tasked with capturing the Maeda Escarpment, a 400-foot jagged cliff that the soldiers nicknamed Hacksaw Ridge. The name alone should tell you everything you need to know. This wasn't just a hill. This was a vertical wall of rock and death. And at the top, the Japanese were waiting with everything they had. The American forces climbed cargo nets to reach the top of the ridge, completely exposed to enemy fire the entire way up. Once they made it to the summit, they found themselves in a hellscape. The Japanese had created a network of tunnels and caves, popping out to attack and then disappearing before you could even return fire. Grenades were flying, mortars raining down, machine gun fire cutting through the air. Men were falling everywhere, torn apart by shrapnel and bullets, screaming for help that often never came. May 5th, 1945. This was the day that everything changed. The 77th Infantry had pushed forward across the ridge, engaging in brutal close-quarters combat. But then the Japanese launched a massive counterattack. They came in waves, overwhelming the American positions, forcing a retreat. The order was given to fall back, to get off the ridge and regroup. Soldiers scrambled for the cargo nets, desperate to escape the slaughter. Within minutes, the ridge was abandoned by American forces. Almost. Desmond Doss stayed behind. While everyone else was running for their lives, Desmond was running toward the wounded. There were 75 men up there, torn apart and bleeding out, left behind in the chaos of the retreat. Command had written them off. You couldn't thin them down. The enemy controlled the ridge. Going back was automatic death. But Desmond didn't care about any of that. He had wounded soldiers who needed him, and he wasn't leaving without them. For the next several hours, Desmond worked alone at the top of Hacksaw Ridge. The Japanese were everywhere, hunting for survivors, executing wounded Americans they found. Desmond crawled through the carnage, moving from one wounded man to the next. He'd apply tourniquets, bandage wounds, give morphine to those in unbearable pain. Then came the impossible part. He had to get them off the cliff. There were no cargo nets anymore, no easy way down. So Desmond improvised. He tied ropes around the wounded men, creating a makeshift sling, and lowered them down the sheer face of the cliff one by one. Think about the physical toll of this. Each man weighed anywhere from 150 to 200 pounds plus their gear. Desmond had to drag them to the edge, secure the rope, and slowly lower them down 400 feet while maintaining enough control that they wouldn't smash into the rocks. And he did this 75 times. In between, he was dodging grenades, hiding from Japanese patrols, praying that he'd live long enough to save one more. That became his mantra, his prayer through the whole ordeal. Lord, please help me get one more. Just one more. The Army initially credited Desmond with saving over 100 men that day. But Desmond, being Desmond, refused to take credit for numbers he wasn't certain about. He insisted he'd only saved around 50. They compromised on 75, though witnesses claimed the number was probably much higher. Desmond was too busy saving lives to keep an accurate count, and in the chaos of battle, nobody was maintaining a roster. What we know for certain is this. Dozens of men came off that ridge alive who should have been dead, and they all owed their lives to a man who refused to carry a weapon. But the story doesn't end there. Desmond stayed on Okinawa, continued treating the wounded, continued risking his life day after day. Then came May 21st. Desmond was treating wounded soldiers when a grenade landed nearby. The explosion tore into his legs, embedding shrapnel throughout his lower body. Desmond was hurt badly, bleeding heavily, but he treated his own wounds and waited for stretcher bearers. When they arrived, he saw another soldier who was wounded worse than him. Desmond gave up his stretcher, told them to take the other guy first. While he was waiting for them to come back, a Japanese sniper's bullet shattered his left arm, splintering the bone. Desmond was in agony, alone, and losing blood fast. His arm was useless, shattered beyond function. But he still had to get himself to an aid station, so he did something that still blows people's minds. This man, this conscientious objector, who had refused to touch a weapon for his entire service, grabbed a rifle stock off the ground and used it as a splint for his broken arm. The irony is almost too perfect. The only time Desmond Doss ever held a rifle was to save his own life, and even then, he didn't use it as a weapon. He used it as a medical tool. He crawled and stumbled his way to the aid station, making it to safety despite his catastrophic injuries. His war was over. His body was destroyed. But he'd done what he set out to do. He'd saved lives, honored his faith, and proven that courage doesn't require violence. The question is, was the price worth it? Because what happened to Desmond after the war, the years of pain and suffering that followed, that's a story most people never hear. October 12, 1945. President Harry Truman placed the Medal of Honor around Desmond Doss's neck. making him the first conscientious objector to receive America's highest military decoration. The ceremony was formal, dignified, filled with military brass and press photographers capturing the historic moment. Desmond stood there in his dress uniform, still recovering from his wounds, accepting an honor that should have made everything worth it. But here's what they didn't tell you at that ceremony. Just weeks earlier, Desmond had been reported as having been taken out in action. His name made front-page news across the country. Dorothy had received notification that her husband was gone, only to find out later it was a mistake, a mix-up in the chaos of war. The psychological damage of that error alone was devastating, but it was nothing compared to what came next. While Desmond was still in the hospital recovering from his combat wounds, doctors discovered something that would destroy the next decade of his life: tuberculosis. He'd contracted it during the campaign in Leyte, breathing in contaminated air in the disease-ridden jungles of the Philippines. TB was a death sentence for many people in the 1940s, a slow, agonizing deterioration of the lungs. For Desmond, it meant the war wasn't over. It was just beginning a new phase. He spent 5.5 years in Veterans Administration hospitals, undergoing treatment after brutal treatment. They removed one of his lungs entirely, along with 5 ribs. Imagine surviving Hacksaw Ridge only to have surgeons carve out pieces of your body in sterile hospital rooms. The treatments were experimental, painful, and only partially effective. Desmond's son, Desmond Jr., was born in 1946. The boy spent the first 5 years of his life barely knowing his father, seeing him only during brief hospital visits when Desmond was strong enough for company. Dorothy would bring the boy to see him, and Desmond would try to be present, try to be a father, but he was broken in ways that couldn't be fixed. The nightmares never stopped. Every night, Desmond relived the battles. He heard the explosions, saw his friends getting torn apart, felt the helplessness of not being able to save everyone. The technical term is post-traumatic stress disorder, but in the 1940s and 50s, they just called it shell shock or battle fatigue, and there was no real treatment for it. Desmond would wake up screaming, drenched in sweat, convinced he was back on Okinawa. One recurring nightmare haunted him more than the others. He dreamed that his mother was lying wounded on the battlefield, and he couldn't reach her, couldn't save her, could only watch as she suffered. The PTSD created a distance between Desmond and his son that would last for decades. Desmond Jr. later spoke about feeling like his father was unreachable, locked away in memories of a war that had ended years ago. There were periods of estrangement, times when father and son barely spoke, both carrying wounds that neither knew how to heal. The man who had saved 75 lives couldn't figure out how to connect with his own child. The irony was crushing. Then came 1976. The antibiotics used to treat Desmond's tuberculosis had side effects that nobody fully understood at the time. They destroyed his hearing completely. At 57 years old, Desmond Doss went totally deaf, cutting him off from the world in yet another way. Dorothy became his link to everything, translating conversations, helping him navigate a world he could no longer hear. He called her his hearing ear dog, trying to make light of a situation that must have been terrifying. 12 years later, in 1988, Desmond received one of the first cochlear implants, a revolutionary device that restored some of his hearing. But by then, he'd spent over a decade in silence, isolated even further from the life he'd fought so hard to return to. The physical toll was obvious. The missing lung, the shattered arm that never fully healed, the deafness, the scars covering his legs from the grenade. But the psychological toll, the weight of PTSD and survivors' guilt, that was invisible. Desmond carried the faces of every man he couldn't save, every soldier who died while he was helping someone else. He remembered their names, their voices, their last words. That burden doesn't show up on medical charts. It doesn't earn you any medals. It just slowly crushes you from the inside, year after year, until you can't remember what it felt like to be whole. People saw the Medal of Honor recipient. They saw the war hero who did the impossible, but they didn't see the man lying awake at night, counting the lives he saved and the lives he lost, wondering if he'd made the right choice, wondering if his faith had been worth the cost. And through all of it, through every surgery and every nightmare, and every moment of doubt, there was Dorothy, the woman who had married him knowing he might not come home, who had waited through 5 years of hospitals, who had raised their son essentially alone, who had become his ears when the world went silent. She was the unsung hero of this entire story, and nobody gave her a medal for it. For 49 years, Dorothy Doss stood beside a man the world called a hero, and she did it without complaint, without recognition, without anyone acknowledging that she was fighting her own war every single day. While Desmond was in VA hospitals from 1946 to 1951, Dorothy worked as a nurse to support their family. Think about that. Her husband was a Medal of Honor recipient, celebrated across the country, but they still struggled financially. The military provided some support, but it wasn't enough. Dorothy had to work full-time while raising Desmond Jr. alone, visiting her husband in the hospital whenever she could steal a few hours. She'd walk into those hospital rooms and put on a brave face, tell Desmond everything was fine at home, that their son was doing great, that she was managing just fine. But she was drowning. Raising a child alone is hard enough without the added burden of a husband who's physically and psychologically broken. There were bills to pay, a house to maintain, a young boy who needed his mother's full attention. And through it all, Dorothy never wavered in her faith, never questioned why God had put her through this trial, never considered walking away even though nobody would have blamed her if she had. When Desmond finally came home from the hospitals in 1951, Dorothy's role didn't get easier. It just changed. Now she was a full-time caregiver for a man who had nightmares every night, who struggled with depression and anxiety, who was physically limited by his missing lung and damaged body. She learned to recognize the signs when Desmond was having a bad day, when the memories were too heavy, when he needed space, or when he needed company. She became an expert at navigating his moods, at providing support without making him feel weak or dependent. Then came 1982. Dorothy was diagnosed with breast cancer. After decades of caring for everyone else, her own body was betraying her. She underwent treatment, faced her own mortality, dealt with the fear and pain of cancer, while still maintaining the household and supporting Desmond. The woman was made of something stronger than steel. Most people would have crumbled under that weight, but Dorothy kept going. She beat the cancer, at least temporarily, and went right back to being the foundation that held everything together. In 1976, when Desmond lost his hearing, Dorothy became his interpreter, his connection to the outside world. Every conversation had to go through her. Every phone call, every interaction, every moment of daily life required Dorothy to be present and attentive. She'd repeat what people said, help him follow conversations, make sure he didn't miss important information. It's exhausting being someone else's ears, being responsible for ensuring they don't become isolated from the world. But Dorothy did it with grace, with patience, with a love that never seemed to diminish, no matter how heavy the burden became. Desmond Jr., their son, later said something that cuts right to the heart of this. She's the most underrated person in this whole thing. He watched his mother sacrifice everything for decades, watched her carry the weight of their family on her shoulders, watched her remain devoted to a man who was haunted by demons he couldn't escape. And nobody talked about it. Nobody made documentaries about Dorothy. Nobody awarded her medals for her service. The world celebrated Desmond and forgot that behind every hero is someone who makes that heroism possible. Someone who picks up the pieces and holds everything together when the hero falls apart. Dorothy's faith was just as strong as Desmond's, maybe stronger. She believed that God had a purpose for their suffering, that their struggles were part of a larger plan they couldn't fully understand. That faith sustained her through decades of hardship, gave her the strength to keep going when everything seemed impossible. She and Desmond would pray together, read scripture together, find comfort in their shared belief that this life wasn't the end, that heaven awaited them when their trials were finally over. But faith doesn't make pain disappear. It doesn't make cancer less terrifying or PTSD less destructive. It just gives you a framework for enduring it, a reason to believe that suffering has meaning. Dorothy endured more than most people could imagine, and she did it with a quiet dignity that deserved recognition, but rarely received it. She was the true hero of the Doss family, the person who made Desmond's survival possible, who gave him a reason to keep living when the nightmares and pain made him want to give up. And in November 1991, just like that, she was gone. November 17, 1991. It was supposed to be a routine trip. Dorothy needed to go to the hospital for a follow-up appointment related to her cancer treatment. They'd made this drive dozens of times from their home on Lookout Mountain, Georgia. It was less than a mile, just a short trip down the mountain roads they knew by heart. Desmond was behind the wheel. Dorothy was in the passenger seat. They were talking, maybe about the appointment, maybe about what they'd have for dinner that night. Normal conversations, normal moments. The kind of day that makes you forget how fragile everything really is. Then something went wrong. Maybe Desmond had a moment of confusion. Maybe his physical limitations caught up with him. Maybe it was just a tragic accident that could have happened to anyone. The car veered off the road. In seconds, they were plunging down an embankment, at the vehicle rolling and crashing through brush and trees. The impact was catastrophic. Emergency responders arrived as quickly as they could, but there was nothing they could do for Dorothy. She was 70 years old, and the crash took her instantly. Desmond survived, injured but conscious, trapped in the wreckage with the woman who had been his entire world for 49 years. Imagine that moment. The man who had saved 75 lives under enemy fire, who had dragged wounded soldiers down a 400-foot cliff, who had survived grenades and bullets and disease, couldn't save his own wife. He was right there next to her, and he was powerless. All his training, all his faith, all his experience as a medic, and none of it mattered. Dorothy was gone, and Desmond had to live with the knowledge that he'd been driving. Whether it was his fault or just a terrible accident, the guilt must have been unbearable. The funeral was held at their church, the same Seventh-day Adventist community that had sustained them both through decades of trials. Friends and family gathered to mourn Dorothy, to celebrate her life, to support Desmond in his grief. But how do you comfort a man who's lost the person who made his survival possible? Dorothy had been his interpreter, his caregiver, his companion through PTSD and surgeries and nightmares. She'd been his link to normalcy, the one person who knew all his demons and loved him anyway. Without her, Desmond was adrift in ways that went far beyond the practical challenges of being deaf and disabled. The cruel irony wasn't lost on anyone who knew their story. Desmond had walked through hell in World War II and come out alive. He'd faced death 1,000 times on the battlefield and survived. He'd beaten tuberculosis when it should have ended him. He'd overcome deafness and physical disability and PTSD. But he couldn't survive a mile-long drive to the hospital. The randomness of it, the senselessness, that's what makes tragedy so devastating. There's no enemy to fight, no clear cause, no way to make sense of why this happened now, after everything they'd already endured together. Desmond was 72 years old, and suddenly he was alone in a way he hadn't been since before he met Dorothy at church 5 decades earlier. The house was too quiet. The routines they'd built together over 49 years were shattered. Every room held memories of her. Every moment of the day reminded him of her absence. His son Desmond Jr. tried to be there for him, tried to bridge the gap that had existed between them for so long. But grief is isolating. It puts you in a place where nobody can really reach you, no matter how much they love you or want to help. In the months that followed, Desmond had to confront questions he'd probably been avoiding his whole life. Had it all been worth it? The choice to serve without weapons, the years in hospitals, the PTSD and disability, the strain it had put on his family. He'd saved 75 lives at Hacksaw Ridge. But what about his own life? What about Dorothy's life? The decades she'd spent sacrificing for a man who was broken by war. These are the questions that haunt survivors, the ones that don't have easy answers, the ones that faith can help with but can't completely resolve. But here's the thing about Desmond Doss. Even in the depths of grief, even after losing the person who mattered most, he didn't give up. He didn't let the tragedy define him or destroy him. He'd survived too much, endured too much, to quit now. And in an unexpected turn, he found a way forward, found someone who could help him navigate the final chapter of his remarkable and painful life. July 1st, 1993. Less than 2 years after Dorothy's death, Desmond married Frances May Duman. Some people might have judged him for moving on so quickly, but anyone who understood grief knew the truth. Desmond wasn't replacing Dorothy. Nobody could replace 49 years of history, of shared suffering and faith. Frances was a companion, someone who could help him navigate the practical challenges of daily life, someone who understood that he needed support to survive. She knew what she was getting into, knew that Desmond came with decades of trauma and physical limitations. She chose to be there for him anyway, to give him some measure of peace in his final years. Desmond continued to speak publicly about his experiences whenever his health allowed it. He traveled to churches, schools, military events, anywhere people wanted to hear his story. His voice was weak, his body frail, but his message never wavered. He'd talk about faith, about the power of conviction, about serving your country without compromising your soul. Young people would listen, amazed that this elderly man with hearing aids and visible scars had once been a battlefield legend. Veterans would listen and remember their own wars, their own struggles with what they'd seen and done. In 2004, a documentary called The Conscientious Objector brought Desmond's story to a wider audience. The filmmakers interviewed him extensively, captured his mannerisms and his quiet dignity, let him tell his own story in his own words. The documentary won awards and introduced a new generation to the man who had refused to carry a weapon but had saved more lives than most soldiers who did. Desmond was gracious about the attention, humble in a way that seemed almost impossible for someone who'd accomplished so much. He never bragged about Hacksaw Ridge. He'd just tell the story factually, give credit to God for his survival, and move on. Hollywood came calling eventually. Multiple filmmakers wanted to turn Desmond's story into a feature film, but Desmond was cautious. He'd seen too many war movies that glorified violence that turned combat into entertainment. He didn't want his story exploited or sensationalized. Then Mel Gibson approached him. Gibson had directed Braveheart and The Passion of the Christ, films that dealt with faith and conviction in brutal circumstances. Desmond watched those movies and saw that Gibson understood something important. Violence could be shown honestly without glorifying it. Faith could be portrayed authentically without being preachy. Desmond gave Gibson his blessing to make the film, but he had one condition. The movie had to be honest about his faith, had to show that his refusal to carry a weapon wasn't cowardice, but conviction. Gibson agreed, and Hacksaw Ridge went into production. Desmond wouldn't live to see the finished film. On March 23, 2006, at the age of 87, Desmond Thomas Doss passed away from respiratory failure at his home in Piedmont, Alabama. His lungs, damaged by tuberculosis and surgery decades earlier, finally gave out. Frances was with him. His son was there. He died peacefully, surrounded by family, his long battle finally over. Hacksaw Ridge was released in November 2016, 10 years after Desmond's death. The film starred Andrew Garfield as Desmond and was directed by Mel Gibson with the brutal, unflinching style he'd become known for. Critics praised it. Audiences loved it. Andrew Garfield received an Academy Award nomination for his portrayal of Desmond. The movie made over $180 million worldwide and introduced millions of people to a story that many had never heard. Young people who knew nothing about World War II, who had never heard of Okinawa or Hacksaw Ridge, suddenly knew the name Desmond Doss. Roads were named after him. Schools created awards in his honor. The Army built memorials. The Seventh-day Adventist Church celebrated him as proof that their faith could withstand any test. Desmond became a symbol, an icon, a legend. But here's what often gets lost in the celebration. The real Desmond Doss wasn't a legend. He was a man who suffered enormously for his convictions, who paid a price that most people can't even imagine, who lost decades of his life to pain and trauma and grief. The medals and the movie and the memorials, those came after. During the actual living of it, during the years in hospitals and the nightmares and the struggle to connect with his own son, there was no guarantee any of this would matter. Desmond is buried at the Chattanooga National Cemetery in Tennessee in a section reserved for Medal of Honor recipients. His grave marker includes his name, his rank, his dates of service, and the Medal of Honor insignia. Dorothy is buried near him, reunited with the man she'd promised to meet in heaven if they didn't make it through the war together. They made it through the war, but just barely, and the cost was almost everything they had. The question we're left with is whether that cost was justified, whether faith and conviction are worth sacrificing everything for, whether Desmond's choice to serve without killing was heroic or just incredibly, impossibly stubborn. What does it mean to be brave? We throw that word around casually, apply it to athletes and celebrities, use it to describe anyone who does something mildly uncomfortable. But Desmond Doss forces us to confront what real courage actually looks like. It's not the absence of fear. It's not even the willingness to risk your life, though Desmond did that repeatedly. Real courage is standing by your convictions when everyone around you is telling you you're wrong, when the easy path is right there in front of you, when giving up would make everything so much simpler. Desmond could have taken the easy way out at dozens of points in his life. He could have avoided the draft with his shipyard job. He could have accepted a transfer away from combat when the beatings and harassment became unbearable. He could have picked up a rifle when his life was in danger, and nobody would have blamed him. He could have stayed home instead of climbing back up Hacksaw Ridge to save men who had tormented him during training. Every step of his journey offered him an exit, a chance to compromise, a way to make the pain stop. He never took it. The price of that conviction extended far beyond the battlefield. Desmond lost years of his life to hospitals and surgeries. He lost his hearing, his physical health, part of his lung. He struggled with PTSD that created distance between him and his son. He lived with constant pain and disability. And in the end, he lost Dorothy in a senseless accident that must have made him question everything he'd endured. The cost was enormous, almost unbearable. Was it worth it? Desmond Jr. said something profound about his father's legacy. The war is never over. He didn't mean that literally, didn't mean that World War II was still being fought. He meant that for veterans like his father, the battles continue long after the shooting stops. The physical wounds, the psychological scars, the memories that won't fade, those are the wars that veterans fight every day for the rest of their lives. Desmond saved 75 men at Hacksaw Ridge, but he couldn't save himself from the consequences of that heroism. There are roads named after Desmond Doss now. There's the Desmond T. Doss Health Clinic in Lynchburg, Virginia, the Desmond Doss Christian Academy, the Desmond Doss Council Camp. These are nice gestures, ways of honoring his memory and keeping his story alive, but they can't capture what it actually felt like to be Desmond Doss. They can't convey the weight of carrying 75 lives down a cliff, or the isolation of losing your hearing, or the guilt of surviving when so many others didn't, or the grief of losing your wife in a car accident after she'd stood by you for 49 years through hell. True heroism isn't a single moment of glory. It's not one dramatic rescue or one brave stand. True heroism is the accumulation of thousands of small decisions to do the right thing, even when the right thing is impossibly hard. It's choosing faith over convenience, conviction over comfort, service over self-preservation, and it's living with the consequences of those choices for the rest of your life, even when the consequences are devastating. Desmond's story challenges our assumptions about strength and weakness, about what it means to fight, about the relationship between faith and courage. In a culture that often equates strength with violence, that sees weapons as symbols of power, Desmond proved that you can be more dangerous without a gun than most people are with one. His weapon was his conviction, his faith was his armor, and his courage was his willingness to climb into hell unarmed to save people who had written him off as a coward. So what defines real strength? Is it the ability to overpower your enemies, to fight and win, to dominate through force? Or is it the ability to endure suffering for your principles, to maintain your humanity in inhuman circumstances, to save lives even when killing would be easier? Desmond Doss answered that question with his life, and the answer cost him almost everything. The Medal of Honor sits in a museum now, a symbol of extraordinary valor. But the real medal, the one that matters, is the example he set. The proof that courage doesn't require violence, that faith can withstand any test, and that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is refuse to kill, even when everyone is trying to force a weapon into your hands. The war may never be over for those who survive it. The scars may never fully heal. The nightmares may never completely stop. But the example endures. The story lives on. And every person who hears about Desmond Doss has to confront the same question he faced. What are you willing to sacrifice for what you believe in? What price would you pay to keep your soul intact? In a world that constantly tries to compromise us, that pushes us to take the easy path, Desmond's life stands as a reminder that some things are worth any cost, and that real heroism is measured not in the enemies you defeat, but in the principles you refuse to abandon, no matter how heavy the burden becomes.